For more on the BRICS Summit, I'm joined by Dhruva Jaishankar in Boston. He's a fellow with the German Marshall Fund's Asia program and a specialist on India and Pakistan. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
You know, the new development bank was the biggest news to come out of BRICS, and President Rousseff also said that these countries never have to depend on the World Bank and IMF ever again. What do you think the international reaction will be to this, especially the countries that are heavily involved with the World Bank and IMF?
Well, I think this is primarily a political signal directed at some of the established economies. One of the things you do see coming out of the Fortaleza Declaration is general dissatisfaction with the current order by the BRICS, and also a reminder, a clear reminder that these economies are the economies driving the global economy. So I think the BRICS Bank, in some ways, the BRICS Development Bank is a natural outgrowth of these realities. And it sends a potent political signal to the United States, to Europe, and to Japan, which have traditionally dominated the global international economic order.
Well, jumping off of this development bank, do you think the BRICS countries could eventually become or even form its own trade bloc?
The trade bloc will be quite difficult. Currently, the economic profiles of the 5 BRICS countries are so different. They have such different objectives that's in fact perhaps a step too far. But one of the things that will be interesting to see would be how they manage the control over this bank. I mean, they've already decided that there will be a rotating presidency. I think the Indians will get the first stab at leading this new BRICS Development Bank. It'll be headquartered in Shanghai. But whether they can actually show to the rest of the world that they're able to govern a multilateral international economic organization of this magnitude will be something to watch quite carefully.
Let's turn to some of the other issues discussed during the summit. There are reports that Russian President Vladimir Putin proposed that BRICS countries should be protected against U.S. sanctions. What do you make of that?
Well, I think in this particular instance, President Putin is motivated by somewhat narrower and more parochial concerns related to Russia's economy and the sanctions currently being levied against Russia by the United States and Europe. It's unclear whether the rest of the countries will necessarily join in that effort, not being subject to the same sanctions. But we will have to see. I mean, clearly, President Putin, I think, is motivated by his own national interests in this respect.
Some of the other topics mentioned today include cooperation on terrorism, cybersecurity, and trade. We heard the Indian Prime Minister comment on those issues. Do you see this group growing in influence?
Yes and no. While clearly there's some items that where there is a shared agenda, perhaps in fact concerns over surveillance, international surveillance on the internet being one of them, and that's the one that the Indian Prime Minister raised in particular. At the same time, you have, in fact, quite major differences in the approach and attitudes to a number of global issues by the BRICS countries. So it's unclear whether they can actually form a closer coalition on many specific subjects. In fact, in many ways, their differences, political differences, in fact, outweigh their commonalities. So I think we'll have to see. I think there should be probably a coalition that comes together on specific issues. They're all in agreement on one thing, which is that the current international economic order isn't a particularly equitable one, that they all want a greater say. And this is, in fact, why perhaps they've agreed to develop not just this BRICS Development Bank, but also a currency reserve that would actually provide added a bigger financial safety net for the international economy.
And we've heard varying time frames as far as this development bank getting up and running, anything from 2 years to 10 years. What is your prediction?
We'll have to see. As I mentioned earlier, I think this will be a test in some ways of these countries' ability to work together. It will, I mean, perhaps it's best to keep expectations relatively modest for now. In some ways, even the announcement at this summit perhaps came faster than had been anticipated only a few years ago, when the idea of a BRICS Development Bank even came up for the first time. So they made some considerable progress. whether they can actually, and some of the trickier issues have been ironed out now, where it will be headquartered, the leadership, for example, how much each country will contribute to it and how much control each country will have. And so those issues have been ironed out now. So that is somewhat encouraging for this particular endeavor going forward.
All right, Dhruva Jaishankar, we appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining us from Boston.